In the bustling heart of Dhaka, nestled among narrow alleyways and buildings worn down by time and the damp climate, stood a small house made of exposed bricks. The constant heat made the old ceiling fan in the main room feel like a character in the house. It creaked loudly, spun with effort, yet never failed to fulfill its purpose, however poorly. The walls, layered with faded paint, bore the marks of years lived with struggle. The electricity flickered now and then, as if announcing its own instability, and sometimes left the rooms in dimness, forcing its residents to adapt on the spot. It was in this modest setting that Anika built her world with what she had: colorful threads, simple fabrics, and a quiet courage. She spent her afternoons sitting on the floor on a thin mat, knees bent, eyes fixed on each stitch she sewed by hand. Her hands were agile, steady, calloused from repetition, yet still delicate. Sewing wasn't just a task, it was a silent ritual, almost meditative. As the needles slid through the raw cotton, Anika was building more than clothes. She was reassembling herself. There was something almost magical in the way she turned forgotten scraps of fabric into harmonious forms. On her wall, a single drawing was taped up with yellowing transparent tape, a sketch of a flowing dress, with firm lines and details that revealed artistic sensitivity. It wasn't just an imagined garment, but a reflection of who she was inside, someone who could see beauty even amid chaos. Just a few feet away from Anika, lying on the floor, Zara leaned over a school notebook. The girl, her hair tied in a makeshift bun and her bare feet on the ground, wrote with heightened focus, as if concentration could block out the world outside. The heat clung to her skin, and the pen slipped amid the sweat, but she didn't complain. She knew, even if not fully aware, that the silence shared with her mother was more important than any working fan or a more comfortable home. The two of them formed a small fortress, quiet, persistent, and invisible to those who only recognize value in what sparkles. And it was precisely in that silence where Imran's absence became most present, even while he was still there. His absence wasn't marked only by the times he was away. It was deeper, more painful, an absence that lived in his vacant gaze, restrained words and cold gestures. When he walked through the door, his body was there, but his soul seemed to hover elsewhere, as if the life he had with Anika and Zara had become only a shadow of what he once tolerated. There were no arguments, no shouting, just a growing distance, short answers, and an indifference that slowly took over the space like invisible mold. Anika felt all of it intensely. Even if she said nothing, even if she kept sewing, caring for Zara, and preparing afternoon tea, she noticed every detail. The way Imran avoided his daughter's gaze, how he stayed out longer, how he hurried to change clothes, hiding perfumes that didn't belong to their family routine. Anika's heart, though resilient, also knew the weight of pain, and it was in that setting that she kept her art alive, as a silent attempt to keep something of her own beating, even as everything around her seemed to quietly fall apart. The fan kept creaking on the ceiling, like a never-ending soundtrack. The light, always flickering, blinked for a few seconds before going out completely. In the sudden dimness, the drawing on the wall swayed in the breeze that slipped through a poorly sealed crack. It came loose and fell to the dusty floor, like an omen Anika couldn't name but deeply felt. The image of the dress, now upside down on the ground, seemed to reflect an uncertain future, a subtle shake in something she was still trying to keep upright. Zara, noticing the fallen drawing, silently walked over and picked it up, smoothing it carefully before putting it back on the wall. She didn't say a word. She just smiled at her mother with tenderness. Anika returned the gesture with a gentle nod, going back to her work as if that small act were enough to sustain her for a few more hours. That was how they lived, piecing together what remained, rebuilding each day the dignity that insisted on staying, even when everything else seemed determined to take it away. Time in Dhaka passed unevenly. Afternoons dragged on slowly, while the years slipped by with cruel speed. Anika would look out the window now and then, but she rarely saw anything new. Life outside seemed as distant as the dreams she sketched on pieces of paper. Still, even in the monotony, there was strength in her routine, a strength that didn't shout, but showed itself in the small acts, in the care with each stitch, in the devotion to her daughter's education, in the steadiness with which she set water to boil, even knowing Imran might not eat dinner at home. Everything about her was persistence. And while the city outside carried on in its chaotic rhythm, with horns, heat, and broken promises, Anika stood firm inside her small house, dressed in simplicity and courage. Her home may have lacked luxury, but it carried something no wealth could buy: the presence of a woman who, even wounded, continued to create beauty, even with crooked needles and worn-out fabrics. In that room, where a noisy fan battled the heat and the lights failed often, she kept something far greater alive: the quiet hope that she could still be seen, not as the wife of an absent man, but as the woman who never gave up on herself. The day after the drawing fell, while dust still settled on the edges of the paper taped back to the wall with a fresh piece of tape, the air inside the house felt heavier. Dhaka moved on with its usual rhythm, but in that exposed brick home, time dragged with a silent weight. Anika woke up early as usual. She prepared breakfast with calm gestures, washed the sheets, and laid out the fabrics on the table for another day of sewing. Despite everything, she still hoped, whether by instinct or stubbornness, that something between her and Imran might rearrange itself. It was a subtle feeling, almost imperceptible, but it still moved her. Even without kind words, even as the distance between them grew, she preserved the rituals of daily life, as if that alone could keep the structure standing. But there was something different about that day. The silence felt heavier, and the heat more oppressive. Anika's intuition picked up on signals she couldn't name, but felt clearly. Still, she carried on. She made cardamom tea, tidied the house with more care than usual, and swapped the tablecloth for an old embroidered one she had saved for special occasions. It was as if, unconsciously, she was setting the stage for something she didn't yet know was coming. When the front door opened, the sound was sharp, precise. Imran stepped in with firm strides and a scent that didn't belong in that house. He wore a light, well-pressed shirt, his hair neatly combed, and a new watch on his wrist. The contrast between him and the setting was striking. He looked more like a visitor than a husband returning home. Anika watched him a second longer than she should have, her eyes trying to recognize someone who was slowly slipping from the edges of memory. She said nothing. She simply walked to the kitchen and brought out the tray with freshly brewed tea. She served in silence, placing 2 cups and a small plate of butter cookies on the table. Imran didn't respond. He just sat down without a word of thanks, his eyes distant, more focused on his own thoughts than on the presence of his wife in front of him. The time between them, in that moment, wasn't measured by words, but by prolonged silences and gestures that no longer found reciprocity. What followed was a revelation that, while abrupt, wasn't entirely unexpected. Imran spoke with the coldness of someone who had already made up his mind. He announced that he was leaving the house, that he was taking another path, that he would marry Meher Tabassum, a woman from an influential family with recognized wealth. He said his life now required a different posture, a different companion, someone more fitting for the new circle he was part of. Anika remained still. She listened to every word as if the air around her had turned to glass. It was as though the pain couldn't fit inside her, so she kept it intact, controlled, until he finished. She didn't argue, didn't beg, didn't ask. The disappointment was so deep that not even anger could find space. She simply stepped away, picked up the tray, and walked to the small bathroom at the back of the house. There, with her hands resting on the sink and her eyes fixed on the cracked mirror, she allowed the tears to fall. She didn't cry out loud. She cried like someone who had been expecting that moment, like someone who had rehearsed that pain through lonely nights and silent days. In the living room, Zara remained seated in the same spot. The girl had heard everything. Her eyes were fixed on her notebook, but the pen no longer moved. She didn't understand all the details, but she grasped the essential. Her father wasn't staying. The late afternoon sun began to shine through the cracks in the window, illuminating the particles of dust suspended in the air. The light, now golden, bathed the dress drawing on the wall with a soft glow, as if trying to protect it. But the wind once again swept violently through the room, pushing the window open. The paper came loose once more. This time, it hit the floor with force. Upon hearing the noise, Anika returned to the living room and found the drawing crumpled, torn at one corner, with one of the sketch lines interrupted. She bent down, picked up the paper, and stared at it for a few seconds, as if contemplating not just the damage to the drawing, but the symbolic rupture of something much deeper. She felt, without words, that something inside her had been broken in a definitive way. The paper could no longer be taped back together as before. The broken line would never be the same, and with that, she understood that she no longer needed to try to hold together what no longer existed. Imran gathered a few belongings into a small suitcase. He didn't look back, not at the details of the house, not at the remnants of the life he was leaving behind. He left like someone completing a task, like someone executing a plan made long ago. His detachment held no regret, only convenience. The car waiting for him outside was black, new, and completely out of place on the dusty street. He got in without hesitation. The engine revved with precision and disappeared into the curves of the city. Inside the house, silence returned. But it wasn't the same silence as before. It was heavier, more final. Anika gathered the torn remains of the paper, placed them in the same box where she kept her other sketches, and went back to sewing. Not out of habit, but from a need to pull herself back together. Every stitch of the needle was now an effort to hold herself up. The pain still throbbed, but something new was beginning to take shape, even if it didn't yet have form. Zara came over to her mother, sat beside her without saying a word. Anika gently ran her hand through her daughter's hair. The two of them stayed there, together, like two silent figures amid what remained. Outside, the noise of the city continued unchanged. Horns, voices, street vendors, and the promise of another day just like the others. But inside that house, something had changed forever. Imran's abandonment wasn't just a departure, it was the end of an illusion, and with it came a void that, though painful, began to make space for something else, the possibility of rising from her own ruins. Imran's definitive absence hovered throughout the house like a silent echo, present in every corner, in every object that once belonged to the routine of a shared life. In the days that followed, Anika remained steady, like someone carrying a weight that couldn't be set down. She didn't give in to despair, but neither did she hide the mourning for what had been undone. Zara's presence was her foundation, and at the same time, a reminder that she had to keep going. The house, though simple, breathed a kind of reconstructive silence, as if there, among the rattling fan and the flickering light, a new version of herself was forming. It was a slow process, internal, almost invisible to the outside world, and it was in this context that, on a stifling morning, Anika walked into the small bathroom of the house, the same one where she had so often rinsed away silent tears, and stood there for long minutes in front of the cracked mirror. The crack in the mirror, which split her reflection into two uneven parts, revealed more than imperfection. It was a faithful portrait of the woman before it, fragmented between who she once was and who she might become. Her long dark hair fell over her shoulders like an old frame, keeper of stories she no longer wished to carry. In it were the traces of years lived under someone else's gaze, the knots of accumulated silences, and the weight of others' choices. Anika held a simple pair of scissors, the kind she used for cutting fabric, and raised it with intention. The gesture wasn't impulsive. It was deliberate, profound, almost ceremonial. Without hesitation, she brought the blades through the first handful of hair. The sound of the cut was brief, but the impact inside her was deep and reverberating. She cut another lock, then another, until strands covered the sink like dark petals from a dismantled flower. Her eyes didn't shed a single tear. There was pain, yes, but above it, there was a silent determination, the kind of strength that's born only when one has nothing left but their own courage. When she finished, she looked at her reflection again. Her face looked different, not because of the haircut itself, but because of what it represented. It was as if an old layer had been stripped away, as if now she could see herself more clearly. The cracks in the mirror no longer bothered her, for she understood that even a broken image could reveal truths. She set the scissors aside and carefully gathered the cut hair, wrapping it in a light cotton cloth. Then she walked to the bedroom and opened the box where she kept her old sketches, the same box that held dress designs, doodled dreams, and traces of who she had been. There, among yellowed papers and scraps of fabric, she placed the freshly cut strands. It was her way of recording the end of a cycle. She closed the box gently and returned it to the corner of the wardrobe, as if sealing a secret between past and future. Without delay, she walked over to the small improvised rack where she hung the clothes she had sewn herself. She chose a piece made weeks earlier, during a sleepless night. It was a simple dress, but with delicate detailing on the shoulders and a strong seam at the waist. She dressed calmly, adjusting the fabric to her body with steady hands. The garment bore no brand, no tag, but it represented more than anything bought from an expensive store. It represented her identity, her authorship, her resilience. For the first time in a long time, she felt dressed in herself. The simplicity of that moment was intense. There was no audience, no applause, just her image in the cracked mirror, and the certainty that something new was beginning, even if the exact shape of this new path remained invisible for now. The routine resumed with small adjustments. Anika began waking up a little earlier, walking with firmer steps, sewing with more intention. The same fabrics from before now carried new interpretations, as if each stitch held the energy of someone who had chosen to change the story. It wasn't about reinventing pain, but using it as raw material for rebuilding. She knew the world wouldn't change overnight, that she would still face judgmental glances and practical hardships. But now, a seed had been planted, a seed of autonomy, of recognition, of rebirth. And that seed, even without guaranteed water or sun, had already found fertile ground within her. Zara watched the changes with the sensitivity of a child who feels more than she understands. She noticed the details, the new haircut, the different dress, her mother's more direct gaze. The two continued to share their routine in silence, but something in the air between them had shifted. Anika began to include her daughter in small moments of the sewing process, teaching her simple stitches, showing her how to match colors and make use of fabric scraps. It was a way of passing on not just knowledge, but also the value of creation. Anika wanted Zara to grow up knowing that anything made by hand carries a power beyond its use. It carries the soul of its maker. With each passing day, the house seemed a little more alive. The walls, still faded, now supported new drawings. When the light failed, Anika calmly lit candles, transforming the darkness into brief moments of enchantment. The fan, though still noisy, no longer bothered her like before. It was part of the setting, part of the story. Anika had stopped waiting for change to come from the outside. She had firmly taken on the role of author of her own journey. And in that haircut, in that simple yet profound gesture, she marked the beginning of a new version of herself. Leaner, clearer, more truthful. A gesture that didn't ask for permission, nor needed witnesses. A silent yet definitive right. The days that followed Anika's symbolic gesture were filled with a quiet energy, almost imperceptible to the outside eye, but deeply felt in every corner of the house. She began working with more intensity, creating pieces with more distinctive lines, combining colors and patterns intuitively, with the care of someone who knows beauty can emerge even from simplicity. The haircut, the dress she had made, and the box where she kept her transformed memories now served as internal anchors, symbols of a new beginning that, although still fragile, was already moving forward with strength. The makeshift atelier she had set up in the living room, with an old table and a repurposed wooden shelf, began to take new shape. On the worn surface of the table, neatly folded fabrics accumulated, threads in various colors were arranged in glass jars, and a growing stack of sketches filled reused pages, many drawn in the margins of Zara's old-school notebooks. The girl, increasingly involved in her mother's routine, watched attentively and helped when she could, slowly learning to respect that world of creation and effort that bloomed within their own home. It was on a humid Thursday morning that the first real possibility for change knocked on the door, not in a grand way, but through an elderly neighbor named Halima, who lived 2 houses down. Halima had often watched Anika through the window, recognizing in her silence the same strength she once needed to raise her own children alone. In a casual visit, while dropping off some fabric she no longer used, she mentioned a community meeting happening the following week. She explained that an international project supporting local artisans was looking for women skilled in traditional sewing with a creative touch. The project was sponsored by a South Korean NGO in partnership with a local cultural center. Anika, though surprised, nodded politely and spent the following days considering the proposal with caution. She didn't yet see herself as someone ready to present her work to the world, but she also knew she couldn't ignore the opportunity. There was something different in her posture, a new kind of courage, growing even amid uncertainty. She spent entire nights adjusting pieces, perfecting details, and setting aside the most expressive ones to show. should she decide to participate. On the day of the meeting, she wore one of the outfits she had recently created, a cotton tunic with delicate embroidery inspired by Bengali floral patterns. She tied her short hair with a light scarf and walked to the community center with the box of fabrics in her arms and her heart beating intensely. The place was crowded. Other women had also brought their work, their stories, and their hopes, creating an atmosphere filled with nervousness and quiet anticipation. When it was her turn to speak, Anika took a deep breath. She wasn't used to speaking in public, especially not in front of strangers, but something inside her, perhaps the sum of everything she had lived through in recent months, sustained her voice. With simple words, she shared how she had learned to sew by watching her mother, how each stitch carried a memory, a pain, a triumph. She showed her sketches, explained the care she took with the finishes, and spoke about the importance of preserving cultural identity in every piece. Her voice, though calm, was steady. She wasn't trying to impress, only to share the truth that moved her. Among those present was Taeyang Choi, a representative from the Korean Foundation, sent specifically to identify emerging talents in marginalized regions. Young, discreet, and sharp-eyed, he observed Anika intently from the moment she stood up to the moment she packed her fabrics away. He took notes, examined the pieces carefully, and remained silent throughout the entire event. At the end of the meeting, while some participants left excited about new possibilities, Anika returned home in silence. She wasn't expecting immediate answers or recognition. She had learned not to feed illusions. Yet, even without knowing it, that morning marked the beginning of a new chapter. Taeyang, though he hadn't said a word, recognized in Anika something that couldn't be taught, the authenticity of someone who creates with their soul. In the days that followed, the routine continued. Anika kept sewing, Zara kept studying, and the house kept its rhythm. But something lingered in the air, a quiet anticipation, not born of anxiety, but of conscious hope. 2 weeks later, an official letter arrived at the community center, listing the names of the women selected for the next phase of the project. Among them was Anika Rahman. The invitation included participation in workshops with Korean designers, an exhibition of their work at an international fair, and the possibility of collaborating on future artisanal collections. Seeing her name printed clearly on the letter made it seem to glow in her eyes. She received the news with a contained smile and a long sigh. She didn't celebrate aloud, but inside, something expanded. It was the first time the world had acknowledged the value of what she created with her own hands. And more than that, it was the first time she herself began to see beyond the walls of the house where she had sewn in silence. That night, while putting away her materials and carefully folding the fabrics already selected for the workshop, Anika watched Zara sleeping on the mattress in the corner of the living room. She felt a wave of silent gratitude flood her chest. She knew the journey wouldn't be easy, that she would still face obstacles and doubts, but now she had something that could no longer be taken from her, a door slightly ajar to a possible future. What once was merely survival was beginning to turn into fulfillment. And all of it had started from a simple point, the persistence to keep going, even when the world seemed not to see. The news that Anika had been selected to represent her work in an international craft project arrived like a breath of fresh air inside the stuffy house in Dhaka. Though she didn't show excitement outwardly, she felt a silent transformation within. The letter with her name printed, the official invitation, and the travel instructions all seemed unreal. She had never imagined leaving the country, much less getting on a plane. Her life had always revolved around the narrow streets of the neighborhood, the threads she patiently stitched, and the routine she shared with Zara. And now, suddenly, the world was opening in a concrete and unexpected way. In the days leading up to the trip, she handled every detail with extreme care, choosing modest clothes, organizing her materials, selecting her most representative sketches, and preparing Zara with the tenderness of someone who knows they are about to create a lifelong memory for their child. The suitcases didn't carry much. The essentials fit easily. What truly weighed was the emotional responsibility of representing not just herself, but the entire world she had carried on her shoulders for years. On the morning of the trip, the taxi drove through Dhaka's still dark streets, as the city slowly began to wake up to familiar sounds. Street vendors, distant honking, the hum of worn-out engines. When the airport appeared in front of them, with its artificial lights and modern facade contrasting with the everyday life they were leaving behind, Anika felt the weight of the moment. Zara, holding her hand, looked around attentively. There was excitement in the girl's subtle gestures, but also a strange maturity, as if she understood that this was not just a trip, but a symbolic turning point. Boarding the plane, the sound of seatbelts clicking, the takeoff announcement, the gentle jolt pushing their bodies against the seats. It all felt like a rite of passage. During the flight, Anika remained silent, watching the clouds through the window and thinking about the path that had brought her there. She felt fear, yes, but it was mixed with courage. It wasn't the fear of failing, but of stepping into a world completely unknown. Upon landing in Seoul, the difference was immediately felt. The cold cut through the air, requiring heavier clothing. The clean streets, the quiet passers-by, the respectful traffic signals, everything signaled a different kind of order. There was a calm in people's movements that deeply contrasted with Dhaka's chaotic rhythm. Anika observed everything attentively: the brightly lit subway stations, the digital panels, the minimally decorated cafes, the polite gestures of the attendants. There was no exaggerated luxury, but there was precision in everything, a thoughtfulness behind every detail. She felt small in the face of it all, yet at the same time, she recognized an opportunity to learn, a space where her work could engage with something greater. The NGO responsible for the project provided modest but comfortable lodging near the studio where the workshops would take place. The space was modern, with white walls, industrial machines, abundant natural light, and a large central table where the artists presented their creations. Anika entered with quiet steps, carrying her box of fabrics and sketches, her heart racing at the possibility of being truly seen, far beyond the geographic and social limits that had defined her existence for so long. She was received with kindness. The organizers treated her with respect, explained how the space operated, introduced the schedule of activities, and left her free to explore. Taeyang Choi, who had already observed Anika at the community meeting in Dhaka, appeared shortly after. He wore simple clothes but carried a natural air of authority. He passed by her with a slight nod, showing recognition and interest. During the first few days, Anika didn't speak much. She preferred to observe, to learn, to understand the rhythm of the new environment. She watched the other participants, discovered unfamiliar techniques, and gradually found her place. The moment to present her pieces arrived without warning. Taeyang was present, along with other evaluators, and she discreetly displayed some of her creations that combined modern cuts with traditional Bengali fabrics. There was the touch of memory, of cultural heritage, but also the attempt to communicate with a broader audience. The reactions were positive, but what struck Anika most was Taeyang's expression. He watched with sincere attention, with eyes that truly saw potential, without needing to say a word. From that point on, she felt encouraged to create more. The daily workshops became her new routine. The studio turned into a second, temporary home. She began designing more freely, exploring new ways to apply traditional patterns to contemporary cuts. She blended bold colors with neutral tones, experimented with textures, adapted local symbols into subtle embroidery. With each new piece, she felt more connected to her identity, not as something fixed, but as a bridge between past and future. Creating far from home gave her a different perspective. Now she could look at her origins with enough distance to value them without the pain that had long been woven into her memories. Her lines became firmer, her finishes more precise. She began arriving early at the studio and leaving late, even when the day's activities were done. The creative process absorbed her completely. Zara, who followed everything closely, turned the studio's hallways into quiet playgrounds, watching her mother with admiration and understanding, as if she recognized something greater than just work in those movements. Seoul's cold weather required layers of clothing, something Anika quickly learned to adapt with elegance. There was no extravagance in her way of dressing, but there was coherence. She matched the scarves she had brought from Dhaka, with pieces she sewed right there, reinventing her style as she came to understand herself in a new territory. Her relationship with Taeyang remained professional, but there was a kind of mutual respect between them that showed in simple gestures, a nod, a glance, a brief compliment that didn't rely on words, but on the silent connection between two very different worlds, recognizing each other through art. He passed by her often, observed her creative processes, offered occasional suggestions when necessary, but above all, allowed her to find her own path. That freedom was, for Anika, a rare gift. No one had ever trusted her like that. No one had ever given her such a clean, neutral space, so free from oppressive expectations. As the weeks passed, Anika's pieces began to stand out, not for extravagance, but for their delicacy. There was something deeply genuine in her creations, something that touched people without needing explanation. The fabrics she used carried the memory of her homeland, but the way she transformed them revealed the woman she was becoming. Aware, determined, capable of translating experiences into shape, texture, and color. Her name began circulating among the project members, and some local alternative fashion magazines asked to photograph her designs. The initial shyness gave way to a more confident stance. She no longer hid. She no longer needed to shrink herself to fit anywhere. Now, it was the space that began to adjust to her presence, and that was reflected not only in the clothes, but in the way she walked, looked people in the eye, and held her own gestures. Zara, in turn, seemed to grow each day in that new environment. Although still very young, she absorbed cultural differences with ease. She loved the local markets, the organized gardens, the different suites. She learned to say a few words in Korean, earned the affection of studio staff, and followed her mother's progress with curiosity. Anika, watching her daughter sleep peacefully in such a faraway country, felt that every effort was beginning to make sense. She was far from home, but for the first time, she didn't feel out of place. The longing, though still present, no longer weighed like before. It was a lighter kind of longing, accompanied by purpose. In the final week of the program, Taeyang invited her to present a capsule collection inspired by Dhaka. It would include only 5 pieces, but enough to make a statement in a cultural exhibition focused on the fusion of traditional and contemporary styles. Anika accepted calmly. She didn't see it as a peak, but as one more solid step on a path that was finally beginning to take clear shape. The woman who had once gathered pieces of her own hair before a broken mirror was now creating with the confidence of someone who had realized she didn't need to fit in, only to stay true to what she already carried inside. The capsule collection Anika created in the Seoul studio was completed with the same care she had always devoted to each stitch since Dhaka, but now there was a new strength pulsing behind every line, as if the woman who shaped those pieces had expanded beyond the seams. The cultural event's purpose was clear: to bring together artists from across Asia who worked with the fusion of traditional and contemporary forms, highlighting their roots and personal expressions through handmade fashion. Anika felt honored to have been chosen to present her work there, and although she didn't express emotions easily, there was a calm glow in her eyes that revealed how much that moment meant to her. Her 5 designs were displayed in a gallery room divided by thematic sections. The space dedicated to her collection was marked by earthy tones and natural fabrics, with soft lighting that emphasized the hand embroidery and cuts inspired by traditional Bengali garments, now reinterpreted with a modern, fluid, and quietly elegant touch. Her name was printed on a minimalist plaque above the central table: Anika Rahman, Living Heritage in Fabric. The opening of the exhibition brought together designers, journalists, art curators, cultural representatives, and visitors interested in fashion with Seoul. As the guests began to walk through the exhibition halls, Anika's pieces drew attention organically. There was no excessive shine, no loud colors. What caught people's eyes was precisely the balance between delicacy and identity. The way traditional Bengali fabrics harmonized with urban cuts created a visual narrative that transcended borders. The details of the hand embroidery, crafted with patience and history, spoke to modern silhouettes that could exist in any capital in the world. Gradually, photographers began to gather in front of her rack, capturing the details, the patterns, the subtle contrasts. The camera flashes, once distant from Anika's reality, now recorded the traces of a journey that had started in a forgotten corner of Dhaka, and now unfolded there, in a room full of attentive eyes. Taeyang Choi, always discreet, watched everything with a serene expression. At one point, he approached Anika and led her to a brief formal introduction in front of a small group of international guests. No exaggeration, no elaborate speech. He simply introduced her as a rare artist, someone who sewed not only clothing, but stories, roots, and emotions. His words were received with respect, and more than that, with genuine interest. Anika's presence, quiet yet firm, conveyed something that couldn't be explained with words. the reflection of a woman who had found her place in the world through what she could create with her hands. The recognition didn't come from charity, nor from an exotic exaltation of her origins. It came from the strength of what she delivered. Original, precise work, full of meaning, yet with the kind of visual lightness that made her creations universal. Over the next few hours, Anika was approached by curators and journalists, eager to learn more about her creative process. Photographers invited her to pose for portraits alongside her pieces. Some representatives from fashion institutes asked for her contact information for future collaborations. Amid so many gestures and requests, she remained centered. She answered what was necessary, explained with simplicity the paths she had taken, and shared parts of her journey, always with humility and clarity. What moved her there wasn't a desire for fame, but the awareness that she was finally being understood for what she created, not just for what she had endured. In one of the most symbolic moments of the night, a European journalist asked about the inspiration behind the lines of her collection. Anika responded naturally that her inspiration came from daily life, from childhood memories, from the fabrics her mother used to store, and from the smell of spices that filled the house while she embroidered. She explained that each stitch was an attempt to preserve something that time tried to erase, but that art could recover. The hall, filled with soft voices, wine glasses, notebooks, and digital screens, embraced Anika's work as something legitimate. There was no need to emphasize origins, dramatize hardships, or romanticize pain. What mattered there was the result, a collection that was coherent, beautiful, and rich in meaning. And she had delivered exactly that. The recognition didn't erase the past, but it redrew her place in the story. Now, she was seen as someone who had triumphed without giving up her essence. The woman who once sewed by the flickering light of a modest home now walked among metal structures and glass walls, with quiet, firm steps, being watched with respect by people who would never know the details of her pain, but who genuinely admired what she had built from it. Zara, who watched everything with sparkling eyes, understood clearly what was in front of her. The daughter didn't need to hear anything to know that night meant more than any award or praise. It was the symbol of the rebuilding she had witnessed since her mother's very first silent stitch. The two of them, side by side, took a photo at the end of the exhibition, the only one of that night. Anika, with her now well-shaped haircut, and Zara, with the firm gaze of someone who had also overcome absence, smiled without exaggeration. It was the smile of a quiet victory, from someone who didn't need to say they had won. The world now knew. The cultural event ended its program with elegant calm. The lights in the gallery were slowly turned off, and the last guests dispersed with thank yous and handshakes. The night outside remained cold, with Seoul's streets wrapped in a constant, sharp breeze. In the hotel lobby, Anika walked in silence, holding a small folder with some documents and mementos from the event. She was serene, still absorbing everything she had lived in the past few days, not letting euphoria spill out from her skin. There was no rush to return to her room. Zara was asleep under the care of a project assistant, and for the first time in a long while, she felt she could breathe with ease. The recognition she had received hadn't changed who she was, but had solidified the path she had decided to build with her own hands. As she walked across the bright, polished marble floor of the hotel, her footsteps echoed in rhythm, as if following the inner tempo of someone who no longer owed anything to the past. And at that exact moment, the past was waiting for her, seated in one of the lobby armchairs, wearing the same expression of someone who no longer knew where they belonged. Imran was there, but he was no longer the man who had once walked through that door to announce his departure. He wore a wrinkled blazer, a crumpled shirt, and his eyes were marked by deep, dark circles. His hair was slightly unkempt, and his expression revealed sleepless nights, weighed down by a void that now seemed to demand something urgent from him. When he saw her, he stood up hesitantly, as if his very presence were already a tired attempt at an apology before he even spoke. Anika stopped. She didn't step back, but she didn't move forward either. She observed the figure in front of her with the detachment of someone who no longer expected anything. Imran, for his part, took a few steps, trying to approach, carrying in his eyes not only the weight of guilt, but the raw shame of someone who realized, far too late, what he had lost. He spoke in a low voice, with restrained gestures, trying to explain that Meher had left him, that everything he once imagined as a rise had turned into a labyrinth of disillusionment. He said that after a few months of cold, luxurious living, the truth about his infertility came out like a stigma, and that without the promise of children, Meher pulled away, leaving him with cold contracts, separate accounts, and a silence more painful than the one he had once handed to his own wife. The revelation seemed to matter more to him than to Anika. She listened, but did not react with emotion. Not because she was indifferent, but because she had moved through something deeper. She was no longer the woman waiting for an explanation, no longer the one trying to decipher the gestures of an absent husband. Now, she looked at the man before her, as one might look at a piece of the past that no longer fit into the present. Imran spoke of regret, of longing, of wanting to return. He mentioned Zara, said he missed his daughter, lamented the choices that had brought him there, but his words seemed to echo into a space where they no longer found shelter. What had once existed between them was over, not with hatred, but with the clarity of someone who understood that some losses don't need to be undone, only acknowledged. Anika remained composed. Her body did not tremble. Her expression did not waver. She felt no anger, nor pity, only the realization that she was standing before a man broken by his own decisions, and that no matter how painful it was to see him in that state, it no longer had anything to do with her. The hotel lobby continued with its usual routine, guests coming and going, receptionists organizing check-ins, soft background music filling the space. It was as if the encounter happened within a bubble of silence, where only the two of them existed. Imran sat again, his trembling hands resting on his knees, his gaze lost somewhere on the floor. Anika remained standing, still, seeing clearly the mismatch between their journeys. He had sunk into a cycle of weak choices, trying to lift himself through false promises. She, on the other hand, had rebuilt her life stitch by stitch, without support, without shortcuts. And now, here, at the very center of it all, she faced the living proof of her transformation. The reunion didn't shake her. It confirmed her growth. It revealed with brutal honesty that the one who left carried the weight of absence, while the one who stayed had learned to fill herself with what she built alone. She didn't respond with words, nor with affectionate gestures. Her steady presence was the only possible answer. The man who had left her in search of status and comfort at another's side was now reduced to a tired body, asking to return to something that no longer existed. There was no home to offer anymore, no space for reconstruction. The love that once existed had not survived absence, neglect, abandonment. And even if his words now sounded remorseful, it was too late for any return. Anika gave Imran one final look, a clean look, free of unresolved bitterness. Then she turned and walked toward the elevator with the same posture with which she had entered the exhibition hall days earlier, upright, serene, fully present in herself. As she crossed the corridor, she carried no weight. She left behind only what no longer belonged to her. And deep down, she knew the true reunion hadn't been with Imran, but with the woman who had emerged from pain, with dignity and strength. Anika stepped into the elevator feeling the silence settle over her shoulders, like a curtain just drawn closed. The metal doors shut behind her with a crisp sound, and the mirrors around her reflected a woman who no longer carried remnants of the past. The expression on her face was serene, but firm. The encounter with Imran hadn't shaken her, nor awakened forgotten feelings. It had served only as a reflection of how much she had grown since the moment he walked out the door, years ago, wearing a well-pressed suit and carrying the coldness in his eyes of someone who doesn't hesitate to erase a history. Now, everything was clear. What he was seeking wasn't forgiveness, nor love. It was relief. He wanted her to return the image of the woman he once abandoned, because that memory, that version of the silent wife who quietly accepted neglect, felt more comfortable to him than facing the emptiness left by his own choices. But Anika was no longer that woman, and that realization, though unspoken, was irreversible. When she reached her floor, her steps remained calm. Each step echoed along the wooden corridor as an answer to what had just occurred. She carried no guilt, no burden, only the closing of a cycle that had nothing left to give. Inside the room, Zara was already awake, sitting at the edge of the bed with a notebook on her lap and her feet swinging above the carpet. The girl's face lit up when she saw her mother walk in. Anika smiled gently and approached. Her daughter's presence was a soft yet powerful reminder of everything that truly mattered. She embraced her lovingly and stayed there for a few moments, just feeling the warmth of a love that had never left her. Then, while Zara returned to her drawings, Anika arranged the small table where she kept her fabrics and prepared the materials she would take the next day to another meeting for the project. But before she could finish organizing, a faint sound at the door interrupted her. It was a soft knock, almost hesitant. Anika already knew who it was. She walked to the door with the calm of someone who had already made every important decision. When she opened it, she saw Imran once again, now without his coat, his shirt partially unbuttoned, and his eyes even lower than before. He didn't speak right away. He just looked at her, as if waiting for her to break the silence. But she didn't. The silence was her answer. Imran then stepped forward, crossing the threshold as if seeking refuge in a place that no longer belonged to him. The room remained lit with a soft glow, and the air carried the light scent of incense that Anika often lit during quiet evenings. Imran walked slowly to the center of the room, as if looking for something he couldn't name. He tried to speak, tried to reorganize the same words he'd used in the lobby, now with a more emotional, more desperate tone. He said he regretted it, that he missed her, that no luxury had replaced the presence of her and their daughter. He repeated that he had been rejected, that the woman he traded everything for left him upon discovering he couldn't have children, and that, faced with that, the emptiness had swallowed him whole. But every word sounded like a distant echo. What he said no longer reached the place that had once been vulnerable. Anika just listened. Her eyes sought neither comfort nor confrontation. She watched with the serenity of someone who had come to understand that some pain no longer needs healing, only to be left behind. Imran, in a gesture of total humiliation, dropped to his knees, his hands pressed to the floor, his head bowed, breath uneven. He waited for some reaction, any gesture that would return to him control of the narrative. But there, in that scene she may once have bitterly imagined, Anika did not move. It was no longer about pain. It was about freedom. Zara, who until then had remained absorbed in her drawings, sensed the shift in the room. She stood and walked toward the bedroom door. When she saw the man kneeling before her mother, she furrowed her brow with quiet curiosity. She didn't remember him clearly. She knew, somewhere in her memory, that he had been absent, but she didn't yet understand the full depth of what that meant. She observed for a few seconds and, with the natural ease of a child simply verbalizing what she saw, asked who that man was. The simple question, spoken with innocence, cut through the air with more impact than any scream. Anika turned to her daughter, keeping her gaze steady, and answered with the dignity of someone who was finally closing a chapter. That man was someone who chose to leave, and that was all that needed to be said. The answer carried no resentment, no judgment. It was just the plain truth, delivered with grace. Zara accepted the explanation with a small nod, as if understanding the essence of the story without needing every detail. Then, she returned to her corner and resumed her drawings. Imran remained on his knees for a few more seconds, but soon realized that nothing there would move in his direction. There would be no return, no explicit forgiveness. Not because Anika was cruel, but because what they had once been no longer existed. Time had passed, and with it, the woman he had abandoned had transformed. She had become whole on her own, without needing support from anyone else. And that was his true punishment. Not contempt, but the calm indifference of someone who no longer needed his presence to feel complete. Slowly he stood up. His body felt heavier than before. His shoulders slouched, his eyes still cast downward. He walked to the door, opened it with the same hesitation he had arrived with, and left without saying a word. The hallway was silent again. Anika remained standing for a few moments, letting her breath return to normal. Then, she closed the door and returned to her daughter's side, where she once again found her balance. The night passed without haste. Outside, Seoul's lights twinkled with elegance. Inside the room, Anika sat before her fabrics, resuming the outlines of a new creation. She didn't need to talk about what had just happened. It didn't disturb her, nor did it deserve too much space. It was just one more confirmation of the path she had chosen to walk, with strength, truth, and self-love. Now, with the certainty that the past no longer had power over her, she could finally move forward with lightness, and that was all that mattered. The return to Dhaka wasn't marked by ceremony or fanfare. Anika came back to her country with the same restrained gestures, but with a new posture in her gaze, now firmer, more present, more aware of her journey. She carried in her luggage special fabrics, some new sketches, and an entire collection of silent memories from her experience in Seoul. But what weighed most was the symbolic value of what she had achieved. It wasn't just about a successful exhibition or praise from notable names in the fashion world. It was about the confirmation that her identity could become art, that her story, once confined to the narrow walls of the house where she sewed in silence, now had room to bloom freely. Back in her city, she walked the streets with a new awareness. The neighborhood where she once felt the weight of limitations now welcomed her with new meaning. Dhaka was still noisy, chaotic, and unequal, but now she saw not only the obstacles, she also saw the fertile ground from which she had emerged, and to which she wanted to return what she had learned. In the following months, Anika dedicated herself entirely to a new project, opening her own creative space, an atelier that combined tradition, community, and dignity. The name came naturally, Rahman Roots, a tribute not only to the surname she carried with pride, but also to the cultural and emotional roots that had always guided her work. The location was a renovated cultural center, inside an old restored brick building where local artists showcased their work, and women in vulnerable situations sought training. Anika took over a wing with wide windows, natural lighting, and walls where she hung her sketches, her mother's old embroidery, and patterns she had developed over the years. She didn't want luxury. She wanted soul. Every detail of the atelier was designed so that anyone who entered could feel the value of handmade craft. The wooden workbenches were simple but sturdy. The shelves displayed fabrics dyed with natural methods, sourced from local cooperatives. And at the sewing tables worked other women like her, single mothers, widows, artisans looking for more than just income. They wanted recognition. The team grew gradually. Anika selected each woman with a human-centered approach, prioritizing stories and a willingness to learn. She taught not only techniques, but also principles. She believed sewing was an act of resistance, a way to rewrite one's existence with strength and sensitivity. The fabrics chosen followed the path she had started exploring in South Korea, a blend of local fibers, prints inspired by Bengali nature, and contemporary cuts that respected both comfort and elegance. The pieces didn't aim to follow fleeting trends, but to tell stories, and each one was the result of a collective effort, where Anika led with attentiveness and generosity. Zara was also part of that environment. Now older, the girl often visited the atelier, helping to fold fabrics, tag garments, and organize boxes. Her curious gaze made the space feel even more alive. It was as if, beside her mother, she was already learning that creating something with purpose is also creating a new future for oneself and for others. Over time, Rahman Roots earned a reputation, first in the neighborhood streets, then through cultural cooperatives, and soon after, across the landscape of ethical and artisanal fashion in the country. Anika's pieces began to circulate in local fairs, sustainable events, and small shop windows with refined curation. Her name was once again mentioned in independent fashion articles, and photos of the atelier, with women sewing together and the walls decorated with original sketches, began to be shared as an example of socially responsible art. She didn't let it go to her head. She knew recognition could be fleeting, but real impact was built day by day, with work, patience, and truth. The atelier was not limited to producing clothing. It was also a space of shelter, learning, and transformation. There, lives were intertwined by thread and needle, and each piece carried a fragment of the collective strength born in that place. It was on an ordinary morning, while reviewing a shipment of fabrics, that she received an envelope from France. The sender was the Curation Committee of Paris Fashion Week, one of the most important events on the international fashion calendar. The letter, written with elegance, invited Anika Rahman as a guest collaborator for a special session dedicated to sustainable artisan fashion. She didn't believe it at first. She reread the lines carefully, as if searching for a mistake, a misunderstanding. But there was no mistake. Her name was there, with address, contact, and all the formal details. It was a recognition that exceeded any expectation. She hadn't sought it, hadn't sent a portfolio, hadn't applied for any call. The invitation was a natural consequence of the path she had built, the unique voice she had expressed in her pieces, and the consistency with which she had always guided her work. Her heart beat harder, but she didn't scream or celebrate wildly. She simply sat for a moment, holding the paper between her fingers, and allowed herself to breathe. She was ready. In the following days, She shared the news with the team with the same gentleness she used when organizing patterns. The women celebrated with sparkling eyes, some holding back tears. They felt part of the achievement, and they truly were. Anika made sure to emphasize that. She said no piece was hers alone, that each stitch carried the hands of many. When Zara heard about the trip, she simply asked if she could go too, and Anika, with a knowing smile that understood the symbolism of the moment, responded with a gentle nod. Their story, stitched together with such effort and silence, now found new landscapes to expand into. Paris wasn't the final destination. It was just another high point in a journey marked by truth and dignity. The woman who had once been left holding a child now raised her name with strength, not as revenge, but as a declaration from someone who knows her own worth. On the day of the official reopening of Rahman Roots, now with a new facade and international recognition, Anika wore one of her favorite creations, a light tunic with hand-embroidered details from everyone on the team, including tiny flowers made by Zara. She welcomed guests, journalists, artisans, and supporters with the calm of someone who knows exactly where she belongs. She showed them the atelier, introduced her team, talked about the creative processes, always highlighting the value of collective work. It was a day of celebration, yes, but also one of continuity. The world may have been watching her now, but she still kept her eyes on the ground she walked, on the hands that sewed, on the story she continued to build with each thread and fabric. The days following the official reopening of Rahman Roots were peaceful, marked by a slower rhythm, as if everything had finally fallen into place. The atelier ran smoothly, the team worked in harmony, and Zara was growing up in an environment of constant affection and creativity. Anika's notoriety was no longer surprising. It became routine to receive invitations, proposals, and messages of admiration from curators and collaborators, yet she chose to keep simplicity as her guide. She still drank tea with the seamstresses at the end of the day, corrected patterns beside Zara, and cleaned dye brushes with her hands. Her presence in the atelier wasn't that of a distant leader, but of a woman who knew every process and every story behind the pieces made there. In this new phase, there was a quietness, not from a lack of challenges, but from the peace she had earned. And it was precisely within that calm that Taeyang reappeared, not as someone who interrupted, but as someone who arrived slowly, respecting the other's time. He didn't send a message or announce his visit formally. He arrived unannounced, in the golden late afternoon light, as sunlight passed through the atelier windows, casting reflections across the hanging fabrics. He wore simple clothes, carried a small box of natural fabric samples, and had the same observant look as always, the kind that saw beyond appearances, as if his greatest skill was perceiving what lay beneath the surface. Anika welcomed him with a calm smile, as if greeting a familiar presence. There was no surprise, no hesitation, just the natural meeting of two paths crossing again at the right time. He walked through the space with genuine interest, praised the attention to detail, touched the fabrics with respect. They talked about the growth of the project, the atelier's social impact, the invitation to Paris, and the steps she planned to take next. But what lingered between them went beyond words. It was a silent connection, built from the first glance in Seoul, and now matured through time and distance. At the end of the afternoon, Anika invited him up to the terrace, a space she had helped organize at the back of the building, where she placed flower pots, wooden chairs, and a small table for break times. It was where she liked to spend her evenings, when the neighborhood slowed down and the city turned a golden hue that softened even the busiest streets. Zara played in the garden below, where she had drawn with crayons on the ground and arranged pebbles as if they were precious treasures. Taeyang watched the girl for a few moments and smiled. They sat facing each other, and Anika served hibiscus and ginger tea in 2 simple cups of local ceramic. The breeze was light, the sound of the city felt distant, and the silence between them was comforting. There was no need to fill the time with explanations. They both knew they were there by choice, and that choice was enough. As the sky began to take on shades of orange, Taeyang reached out and lightly touched her hand, which rested on the table. The gesture asked for nothing. It simply offered presence. Anika looked at him calmly and responded with a serene smile. No rush, no promises. It was a smile that recognized the beauty of what was beginning to form, but also made it clear that love, for her, was now something different. It was no longer urgency, or dependence, or self-erasure. It was recognition. It was a space where she could exist fully, without having to erase any part of her history. In that gentle touch, there were no grand declarations, only the quiet sharing of two worlds that understood each other effortlessly. He saw her, and that was all she had ever needed. As the two of them remained there, the day faded into soft light. Zara ran through the garden, laughing to herself with her childlike inventions, and the sound of her footsteps filled the space with life. Anika watched her daughter with full eyes, as someone who knew that everything had been worth it. The past no longer hurt. It had become fertile ground from which she drew the strength to build a new future. And that future didn't need to be loud or excessive. It just had to be true. Taeyang, with his calm presence and observant gaze, represented exactly that possibility. A love that doesn't suffocate, doesn't demand, doesn't correct, only embraces. Time passed slowly on that terrace. Neither of them was in a hurry to get up. They stayed there until the sky turned completely dark, sharing each other's presence like tending to a plant that had yet to bloom. There was no need to label what was growing between them. There was no need to rush. Everything that needed to be said was already in the gesture, in the comfortable silence, in the gaze that found rest. When they finally stood up, they walked side by side down the stairs back to the atelier. Zara ran to meet her mother, and naturally held her hand. Taeyang looked at the two of them with the same respect he had always shown her, now deepened by an affection that didn't demand definition. That night, after closing the atelier door, Anika sat alone for a moment by the window. The silence was complete. She felt at home, not just in the physical space, but within herself. She thought about everything she had lived through, everything she had endured, everything she had created, and then with a calm heart, she whispered just to herself, like a prayer, like a realization. Now I know that to love is to be seen, and finally I am.